Professor in Computer Science and member of the Institute for Systems Research. I'm pleased to be here this morning and present George Robertson, our distinguished lecturer. And just before we begin, just a few comments. Iyad Abed is director of ISR, and I'm pleased he provided support for this event and to bring George Robertson from Microsoft to us. The professional side is that George is a fellow of the ACF, and I would say one of the prime leaders in promoting 3D user interfaces. And this started in his earlier work and has a long period of work at Xerox PARC, and then came to Microsoft 8.5 years ago, and has been a proponent of 3D user interfaces during that time period. He's well known for his contribution to the information visualizer, an early 90s visionary design prototype system that influenced a lot of us, myself and many others, in our thinking. He's always been a source of fresh ideas and inspirations. He's been a close collaborator for several of us, and last year we invited him to be a member of the advisory board of the Human-Computer Interaction Lab, which gives me the right moment to promote the 21st annual symposium of the HCIL. Pass those around and come see our latest work, still free for students. And we'll be glad to have you participate in that. About 300 people come to that event, so please join us for that. While I'm passing things around, for those who are from off campus, and I'm always interested, and I think it's useful for our speaker to know, how many are from off campus? From Johns Hopkins APL, we've got a bunch. Where else? From
SAS Institute.
SAS Institute?
America Online.
America Online, all right, yes, we knew you were coming. Who else? Where else?
StreamSage.
What's that?
StreamSage.
StreamSage. Okay, great. Okay, and from on campus, we've got computer science people and ISR. All right. So, and other groups represented. I guess we have communications.
CLIS.
What? CLIS. Thank you. What else? CLIS is information studies. With credit for having organized all of this, an administrator in ISR, and she provided this sign-up list if you'd like to be on further email lists. I'm pleased to hear from several of you that are, as Peggy, who deserves a lot of appreciation for making this two-day event. I'm also appreciative that George came and spent all of yesterday meeting with groups on campus, and we had a chance to talk, and he will be continuing that process today. At 1:30 is an open roundtable. Please come and join for a discussion of the issues that George will initiate this morning, and that will be in the A.V. Williams building just across the road here in room 2168. 1:30, and we invite you for an open and informal discussion. Okay, seeing no other questions, I'll proceed and just apologize. There's been a power failure in the control mechanisms, and the staff got together, and we have I hope a good enough view. If you're having trouble seeing it, please try to come a little closer, and there'll be a lot of interesting detail for you to take a look at. So today, George focuses on an important issue for which he's made major contributions, and he'll take a look at the history of this topic and present, as always, an innovative approach to how to deal with the hierarchies. Thank you, George.
Thank you, Ben. So I'm going to talk about, as Ben said, the history of what's gone on with visualizing hierarchies, as well as some recent work that we've been doing at Microsoft. So hierarchies are certainly one of the most common information structures that people deal with. Users of computers typically interact with hierarchies dozens or hundreds of times every day. Now, over the last 25 years, there has been a lot of research on how to effectively display and interact with hierarchies. In spite of all that work, there are a number of problems that still remain, and I'm going to describe those problems and some of the possible solutions to them. In addition, some recent changes in the industry, we're starting to see more applications that are looking at much larger scale problems that are enterprise-wide and involve dealing with multiple hierarchies at the same time. And not much of that early work focused on dealing with multiple hierarchies. So at Microsoft Research, we started a project several years ago to look at the work that's been done on hierarchy visualization, try to see what the remaining problems are, and come up with some proposed new solutions, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So there are many techniques that have been proposed, and each one of these techniques solves some of the problems that I'm going to talk about, but none of them solve all of the problems, as you'll see when we go through these. And another issue that you'll recognize as we go through the history is that very few of the techniques that I'm going to talk about have actually had user studies done, real testing with real users. So I'm going to give you this history of the 25 years, and one comment to start with is that the Windows tree control, if you look at users out in the general population, it is the hierarchy visualization that is most often used. And as I'm sure you're all aware, there are a lot of problems with it. It turns out we get lots of problems reported by end customers, and also a lot of formal user studies in Microsoft have shown problems with the tree control. In fact, what we found is that our visualization research group, the most requested help that we get from product groups in Microsoft is issues with the Windows tree control. So, what's wrong with this picture? This is the Windows tree control, and it's used in a lot of different ways. It's used in Windows Explorer, it's in the file open and close dialogues, the history mechanism in IE, the favorites mechanism, and a number of other places. So it does some things quite well. In particular, it works in a very small amount of space if you need to get this kind of view in a small amount of space. But it's got a lot of problems. And there are two classes of problems that I want to address. The first is how well a visualization actually fits the data that we're talking about. And we have studies both at Microsoft and at Park before that suggest in the real world hierarchies tend to be very broad and shallow. For example, if you look at either file system folder hierarchies or mail folder hierarchies, you don't see very many levels, but you see a pretty high fan-out rate. We're also beginning to see these problems I mentioned earlier that involve more than one hierarchy. And an example of that, which I'll show you with a demo later on, has to do with an enterprise having multiple overlapping databases with good reason for having the databases separate. An example is databases about people. But there are times when you want to look at all of the information from one interface, and that poses a serious problem because you have very complex relationships going on there, intersecting hierarchies. So we know from looking at the earlier projects that each of the visualizations have some kind of limits, either in the number of levels or the number of nodes, and the visualizations might work well as long as you're within those limits, but as soon as you exceed them, as soon as you scale up, you run into problems, and the visualization doesn't work very well. So the second class problem has to do with cognitive overhead. This is the issue that the interface itself places demands on the user in understanding what they're looking at. So if you have more than about 80 nodes in your hierarchy, you typically can't fit that on a single screen and be able to see the details. And that forces you to go to a different approach, and generally forces you either to lose context or to lose detail. So one of the common early solutions to this was a two-view approach where you had a detailed view and a separate overview view. And the problem with that is that if the user shifts focus of attention from the overview and the detail views, then the user will lose context and take extra time to reassimilate where they were. So another issue is that when you look at real-world tasks, users often want to focus on more than one thing at a time in a hierarchy, and most of the hierarchy visualizations are tailored for a single focus. So another key problem is allowing or supporting multiple focus. And another issue is that when a user selects a node and then scrolls away from it in whatever view they're looking at, most of the visualizations, the user gets lost at that point. They don't know where the selected node is in the tree structure. In fact, you can pretty easily get into the state where you don't even know if it's above you or below you. So there are three basic view management strategies that have been used through this 25-year history. The earliest were these two-view systems with separate detail and overview. Then there were a whole series of approaches that tried various kinds of distortion, even of the data. For example, filtering out less interesting or important material, or distortions of the space itself, like the 3D and hyperbolic views. Both tend to do that. And the third class is focus and context display, and a lot of the work we did at Park was around focus and context displays. The idea here is to try to construct a visualization that has a smooth integration or a seamless integration of your context and the focus all in one view. So there are 5 basic approaches that have been used for visualizing hierarchies. The earliest were simple indented text views. Early on, fisheyes were added to these indented textual views as a way of increasing the amount of useful information that was visible on the screen. Second class is containment systems, and the best example of that is the work that Ben did on tree maps. Tree maps are a 2D space-filling visualization of hierarchies using containment. And I'm sure most of you are aware of what tree maps are about. Another class has to do with clustering data to derive implicit hierarchies and then view those, and they're derived based on some kind of content analysis. And there have been several systems which I'm actually not going to show you these examples. They're Galaxy of News, Dreamscape, and Hot Sauce all do this. Another category has to do with some kind of geographic mapping, either a direct mapping to like a floor plan or street maps or map of the country, or some kind of metaphor that uses geographic mapping. And then the final approach, which is actually the most common, is about node link diagrams. And I'll show you a number of examples of node link diagrams. So I'm going to go through kind of a chronological presentation, a very quick presentation of the last 25 years. And there's a lot that's happened, so I had to pick and choose. You're not going to see everything. I'm sure some of you will know some things that I'm going to skip over. But I want to give you a feel for kind of the breadth of the things that have been tried. So one of the earliest hierarchy visualizations was the Smalltalk system browser. This was at Xerox PARC in 1979. What you're looking at is 4 different levels in a hierarchy. Each of those levels only shows the sibling at that level, and as you advance deeper in, those 4 displays shift over. In the early 80s, George Furness at Bell Labs developed generalized fisheye views, and this is a distortion technique that uses a degree of interest function to determine what information to show and what information to hide. And this particular example is from an early paper he did in a Bell Labs tech report in 1981. It's a calendar view focusing on one particular day. In the mid-'80s, Fairchild, Pultrock, and Furness at MCC did the SimNet system. This was a 3D visualization of a semantic network. It also made use of fisheye views to manage the complexity. This was actually the first 3D network visualization, and it didn't really succeed, and I believe the reason was that they were tackling probably the hardest problem, visualizing a network, and doing it in a very early period of time when the hardware and the visualization techniques really weren't up to the task. So it was just too complex and users couldn't make sense out of what they were seeing. In the early 90s, in 1991, I introduced the cone tree at Chi 91. This is work I did at Park with Stu Card and Jock McKinley. And the basic idea here is I'm solving the context problem in this Focus Plus context display by, if you select a particular node, like if I clicked on that node, then the tree would go through an animated set of rotations so that within less than a second, you would see the selected node and the path up to the root in the front of the tree. So that meant you were always in context. The selected node always had its context available in this one display. Now, it did have some limitations, and you'll see as we go along that there were a number of variants that were proposed over the years that addressed these limitations in one way or another. This particular implementation worked best if there were 10 levels or less and 1,000 nodes or less being viewed, but it could work for up to 10,000 nodes. And notice that there are occlusion problems here, but when you select something and the view brings around the selected path, there's no occlusion in the selected path. So in essence, what we're doing is a different kind of scrolling within a tree here, using these animated rotations. So this is what the system looked like with 10,000 nodes. This was a file system hierarchy on a Unix file system. And at the time, this was, interacting with this didn't work very well because the technology just wasn't quite there. So this was 10,000 nodes was a lot to try to rotate around in real time. But if you applied fisheye techniques to the same visualization and design the degree of interest function so that it takes into account recent selections as well as the current selection, then you get something that looks like this, and the interactive rates are, it's again something you can interact with quite effectively. So also at Chi 91, or actually it was at Visualization 91, Ben Schneiderman introduced the tree map. This is 2D space filling containment visualization. And the early version dealt with about 3,000 nodes, at least that's what was cited in the paper at the time. So this is very good at revealing certain properties of the nodes. For example, this particular visualization is from Disk Mapper, which is a product that Micrologic put out. And we're looking at a file system hierarchy, and the size of the boxes is reflecting the size of the contents of the folder, and the color scheme is reflecting the age of the contents of the folder. So it does a good job of revealing properties that are encoded either in size or color, for example. What it doesn't show very well is the structural relationships. It's very hard to look at this at a glance and understand the hierarchical relationships between objects. Now, like the cone tree, there have been a lot of variations of tree maps, and I think it's interesting that two projects were both presented in that year, in 1991, and if you look at the history of the visualization field, these two projects are the ones that have had the most variants proposed. There are lots of systems that are similar or advancements on countries and people. So in 1992, Joel Tesler at Silicon Graphics introduced FSN, or File System Navigator, or Information Landscape. He used several different names. This might look familiar. Those of you who have seen Jurassic Park, the original movie, this shows up in a scene late in the movie where the young girl is sitting in front of a computer and she looks at this view, and they show this view or something similar to this on the screen, and she says, "I know this system, it's Unix." So this is a 2D tree layout laid onto the ground plane of a 3D environment. And when you select a particular node, you fly into that node. And the problem with that, of course, is that you lose your context as soon as you fly into that node. It's fun to watch, but losing the context is not a good idea. They solved the problem by going back to the old idea of having a separate overview window that shows the entire tree structure and an indication of where you are when you're zoomed in. This basic idea was used by Andrews at the University of Graz in 1995 for a web viewing, a way of looking at a website in a system called Hyper-G. Now there's also been work on 2D network visualizations that are relevant to the hierarchy visualization work. This was the graphical fisheye technique done by Sarkar and Brown at DEC-CERT, presented at Chi 92. This is a generalization of Furness's fisheye technique to 2D graph layout. And the image on the right is the same structure as the one on the left, but it's focused on a particular node. A couple of years later, Sarkar and Snivy at Brown did the rubber sheet visualization, which is a generalization of graphical fisheye that allowed multiple focus. And remember earlier I said multiple focus is one of the problems that hierarchy visualizations don't handle very well. This is one of the few systems that addressed the issue. That same year, I did some work with Jock McKinley and Rob DeLine at Park on the spiral visualization. This was for looking at really large hierarchies or large directed acyclic graphs. And the way it worked was to focus on and show only one particular path, the selected path, through the DAG. This was used, the applications we explored were calendars and large decision trees. So this is looking at a calendar, and the reason for using the spiral is, again, to give this kind of focus plus context, integrated, seamless view. So as you make a selection, the structure rotates around and back in space. So the spiral is giving you your context always in that one view. In 1994, Lamping and Rao introduced the hyperbolic browser. This was actually a reaction to the occlusion problems in the country. Rao was particularly wanted to solve the same problem we were solving in the country, but he didn't like the occlusions, and this was his solution. So he takes a tree structure and does a hyperbolic layout and projects that onto a circle. And the interesting thing about that is that you can pack a lot of information into the periphery. The closer you get to the edge, the smaller things appear. And this could display thousands of nodes, but of course the details diminish as you get close to the edge. In 1995, Bartram at Simon Fraser introduced a continuous zoom technique. This is a generalization of the rubber sheet technique that I mentioned a moment ago, except that she introduced some very smooth transitions when you change from one focus of attention to another. So it's a nice addition to the rubber sheet. In 1995, also, Carrier and Casman at the University of Waterloo introduced FS-Viz, which is essentially a cone tree viewed from a different viewing position. And this was their solution for the occlusion problem. And they claimed they could get around 5,000 nodes on the display with no occlusion. But of course, the nodes are small and far away. So there's a trade-off there. Also that year, Jock McKinley introduced the butterfly visualization. This is was looking at citation index, which is an enormous directed acyclic graph. And hard to describe this briefly, but the idea is you're looking at focusing on a particular paper, looking at the papers that it cites and the papers that cite it, and then you're able to follow the paths in either direction you want. So it's got some asynchronous searching behavior, and the particular structure you're looking at evolves over time to show you the things that you're interested in. So in 1997, Tamara Munzner at Stanford introduced the H3 layout algorithm. This was her attempt to merge ideas from cone trees and the hyperbolic browser. She liked the 3D nature of the cone tree, and she liked the hyperbolic layout in the hyperbolic browser. But the way she merged them was, instead of projecting the hyperbolic layout onto a 2D circle, she projected onto the interior of a sphere and put the selected node at the center of the sphere. So she claimed she could get up to about 20,000 nodes using this technique. In 1998, Zhang and Peng at UC Santa Cruz did reconfigurable disk trees. This is another variation on cone trees trying to solve the occlusion problem. They did two things. The first was changing the viewpoint like FS-Viz did, and the second was collapsing the cones into disks. So that's the lower right image is the disk version of this. And they claimed they could get 3,000 to 4,000 identifiable nodes using this technique. In 1998, Ed Chi at Xerox PARC introduced the disk tree. This is a compact 2D representation that uses concentric circles with each hierarchy level being on a successive circle. So this particular thing is looking at a website where the line size and brightness encode page access frequency, and the color encodes page lifecycle stage. So the advantages of this are that there's no occlusion, it's a compact representation, although it's not space filling, it definitely is a lot of white space here. And their claim is that the pattern in these can be compared over time so that you can easily spot changes. A couple of years later, Stasko and Zhang at Georgia Tech introduced the sunburst visualization. It's similar to what I just showed you, the disk tree, but this is, they claim it's a space-filling visualization on each circle. I'm not sure I buy that claim. Now they did a study comparing the sunburst visualization to tree maps, and in the study that they published, they claimed that users preferred sunburst because they were able to see explicit structural relationships, the hierarchy relationships. And what they presented at InfoVis 2000 was a series of techniques for viewing more detail. There were animated techniques where, for instance, you pick something and an arc of this would get larger and the rest of the circle would compress. Bongshin Lee and Ben Betterson here at Maryland just last year introduced favorite folders, which I wanted to show you. Some of you, I'm sure, have seen this because it's work that was done here, but I think it's important for this talk because it is an example of taking the Windows tree control and augmenting it and trying to solve some of the problems that I talked about earlier. So the basic idea here is that you specify in some way the folders that you're interested in, and then when you look at a particular view, you primarily see the things you've already identified as folders of interest. And that means search time through a folder hierarchy is much reduced because you're looking at a lot less. Also last year at the InfoBiz conference, there was we had our first annual contest. This is something that Catherine Plaisant and Jean-Daniel Fekete organized, and they're also organizing a similar event for this year's conference. Last year's theme for the contest was visualization and pairwise comparison of trees, and there were 6 entries to this contest that received awards. The winning technique was called tree juxtaposer, which I'll show you a little bit more about in a second. That was done by Slack, Munster, and Bredier at University of British Columbia, and Francois here at Maryland. There were also awards given for the other 5 that I'm showing there. These are from Georgia Tech, Fraunhofer, University of Bordeaux, Open University, and University of Tsukuba, and Indiana University. So you can see from everything that I've shown you that there is work on hierarchy visualization going on all over the world. So a little more detail about the tree juxtaposer. This was the winner of the contest last year. This is for structural comparison of large trees, and they were looking at trees that were several 100,000 nodes each, and highlighting the differences. The colored regions there are the areas of differences, and then they treat those areas of difference, or the highlighted areas, as landmarks, and as you move around this, scroll through this, they try to make sure that the landmarks are always visible. That's the key concept to deal with the really large scale. So earlier in 1994, Noik in Graphics Interface 94 had a taxonomy of visualization techniques, and I thought it would be interesting just to quickly go through what he said, because having looked at all those techniques that I just described, it's interesting to see how they fit in this taxonomy. So he had 4 categories. One was implicit visualizations that make use of perspective, for example, and his claim is that these give a continuous focus and context kind of view. Then there are the filter techniques that we talked about, for example, removing items of low interest. And the problem here, in his view, is that this is discrete focus and context, so you see discrete changes as you go along. Then there are various distortions in size or shape or position of elements. Fisheye techniques do this as well as the filtering. And the problem here is that it can make it hard for users to track an item of interest if the distortions keep changing what you're looking at. And the final category was adorned visualizations, that is using color or texture to encode some other property of interest. So let me now turn and look at the unsolved problems, the problems I think all of that 25 years I just went through still haven't really addressed well. The first is multiple focus. The problem here is that in real-world use, what we see is multiple focus is incredibly important. It's one of the, when you look at user comments from trying to use visualizations, lack of multiple focus is one of the first things that gets mentioned. So I'm going to quickly show you some harebrained ideas that we have played with just to get you thinking about ways you might deal with multiple focus. This is a mock-up of folding paper. The column on the left, think of it as a big stack of old-style computer printout paper where the areas you're interested in are stretched out and visible, and the other areas are just stacks of paper. So, for example, these these areas in here are just the stacked regions, and then the areas you're interested in are pulled out, and then you have a second level of detail that you can now actually read, and then if you pick a particular thing, it shows up in a detail area. This is the same idea except trying to use 3D. As you make selections in a particular column going to deeper and deeper levels, if you come to a place where you want multiple focus, then you'll see more than one element displayed in a column, and then the callouts take you to more detail. So this is not actually using the 3D to encode any property of the hierarchy. It's just using it 3D to make that part of the display take less space. This is a concept for how to make hyperbolic browsers deal with multiple focus, and the basic idea is that each focus area you pick produces another hyperbolic view that's showing you the details around that particular focus area. So these are just meant as little brainstorming ideas to get you thinking about multiple focus. Another unresolved problem is that all of that work that I described is focusing on single hierarchies. And we're starting to see lots of examples where people want to deal with multiple hierarchies. And that actually happens in several different ways. One way is that people want to see how a hierarchy is changing over time, so they're going to want to look at snapshots, and essentially what you're looking at is very similar hierarchies and trying to spot the differences between them. And there are some taxonomy visualizations that address this issue. The second class is multi-trees, and these are actually multiple hierarchies with shared subtrees. And then the third class, which is a new term that I introduced a couple of years ago, are polyarchies, which are multiple intersecting hierarchies. And I'll talk more about each of these. So time tube was an example of trying to see changes of a hierarchy over time. This is looking at using the disk trees that I showed you earlier, except laying them side by side and rotated, and supposedly allowing you to spot the differences very easily. I personally find it hard to see the differences looking at it. But their claim is that this is a good way of doing this. Now there was a taxonomy visualization that was done by Graham at Napier University, and it's a beautiful visualization. He's looking at 4 different biological taxonomies and trying to show how they relate to each other by drawing, picking a particular item in the taxonomy and tracking where it appears in the other taxonomies. Although this is very beautiful, he told me after the conference that they tried to scale this up to some real-world examples of taxonomies, and as soon as they tried to scale it up, it fell apart. It really didn't work well at a larger scale. So in 1994, Furness and Zaks at Delcor introduced multi-trees. These are directed acyclic graphs with shared subtrees. And the example he uses is it's about a class syllabus created by one professor. A second professor comes in and wants to reuse some of the material, but only a subset of it. And then the third professor comes in and wants to reuse a different subset, reusing some of the material done by the second professor. So as you can see, it's a collection of trees with shared subtrees. And an actual example of that showed up in work that Tamara Munster did at Stanford, and she also was working with us at Microsoft Research. She used the H3 layout algorithm that I described earlier. Remember, this is the hyperbolic projection onto a sphere. And she's looking at XML structures with multiple inheritance, which is essentially a multi-tree problem. And did a user study that is an interesting user study looking at a topic hierarchy that had 12,000 nodes in it, and compared an existing web-based solution, kind of the best of the kind available, the Windows tree control, and this XML 3D. And the interesting result here was that the XML 3D was reliably faster performance times than either of the 2D solutions. I think this was the first real example of a user study of a 3D visualization that had significant better performance than the 2D solutions. And then a couple of years ago, I introduced Polyarchy, which is the closest previous idea was the multi-trees, but remember, multi-trees are about shared subtrees. The problem with polyarchy is that we're looking at intersecting hierarchies, not shared subtrees. So that means that polyarchy is, in essence, a superset of multi-trees. And I actually spent some time with George Schreines to conceptually verify that this really is a superset of the idea he had with multi-trees. So the other concept that we introduced is we call visual pivot. It's an animated transition from one hierarchy view to another. I'm going to show you a demo in a moment. I think we have time to do that. The key goals we were trying to solve as you watched the demo was we wanted to support multiple hierarchies and other relations from a common interface. We wanted to show search results in the context of whatever view you happen to be looking at. We wanted to show the relationships between the entities in a particular hierarchy or view, and then we wanted to be able to show the relationships between the views, typically rooted on a particular item or set of items that you're interested in. And then we show those relationships using the animated 2D and 3D views. So the demo I'm going to show is based on information about people at Microsoft. It's bringing information from 3 different databases. It has about 65,000 people in it and about 200,000 email aliases. So it's a pretty large structure. Okay, so the left-hand side of this is just a simple search area. I can search on people's names or email alias or a number of other properties. I'm going to search for Mary Chowinski, who was one of my co-authors on this work. And on the right-hand side, if it had found more than one person that matched that search, it would have listed them and I could pick the one I wanted. In this case, there was only one, so it went ahead and put it on the right-hand side. The right-hand side is showing the default hierarchy for a person, which is the management hierarchy. If I bring up the context menu, it shows me the other pivot dimensions or hierarchies or hierarchy views that you can look at. For example, I can switch to a business unit view, and here you'll see the visual pivot that I talked about. So essentially, it showed you very briefly both where she fit in both hierarchies and then pivoted around to the hierarchy of interest. So most of these are very simple hierarchies. Some are more complex views, like related people is showing her direct reports, her manager, and her manager's direct reports. So it's kind of a collection of people she would interact with. Some of them are really trivial, like location of offices can obviously be shown in a hierarchy view. The other interesting thing, of course, is when you add more people to this. So let me go back to the management view and add myself and Kim Cameron. And now you see a couple of things you just saw. It animates all of the additions and subtractions as you're going. It scales the view down so that as much as possible it fits things on a single screen. It has a limit on it. If it has to scale too much, then it will introduce a scroll bar. I'm just showing the paths up to the root here. So I'm showing slices through this huge hierarchy, which means I can actually do structural comparisons between these people. That's a key concept. Let me give you one other quick example, which is...
to let you know, I've been informed that we do have to be out of here at 11. I thought we had some more than that.
Oh.
So I'm really sorry about that, but I guess that gives us about 10 minutes still, which is,
I better wrap up.
really sorry. So you can take, there's still time more for demos, and we do have to be done by 11.
Okay. Let me switch back to the slides then. But you got the general idea. I will be glad to show more demos in the roundtable this afternoon if you want to see more. We can do more.
Is this material available on the website?
There are a couple of publications that describe it. One, a Kai 2002 paper, and the inaugural issue of the Information Visualization Journal has a very detailed description of the user studies that we did on this, as well as the basic system.
Well, are you going to put your talk up on the website?
I can do that, yeah. So, let me quickly point out the key concepts here. Multiple focus by showing you just the slices in the hierarchy, so you get things close enough together that you can actually see the relationships, and you're just showing the information the user really wants to see. The visual pivot is, I showed you the visual pivot around a vertical axis, a rotation. We also did a number of other animated transitions. We had one that was a horizontal pivot around a horizontal axis. We had a sliding animation. The sliding animation and the horizontal pivot were the ones that actually tested best. There's some detail here that the paper in the InfoViz journal goes into a lot of detail about this. We did an analysis of these animated transitions, trying to understand what is actually going on. And there's some earlier work that was reported by Prophet and Kaiser that observes that animated transitions, that there's a significant difference in how people perceive rotations versus translations. And in particular, the rotations define a 3D form, whereas the translations are defining object relative displacement. And what that means is in those various visual pivot animations, the two rotation styles that I showed you are really defining 3D form, which, depending on the particular task the user is doing, that might be important or it might not. In most of the tasks that we used in our user studies, it wasn't that important, so I think that's why the sliding animation turned out to be more effective for those particular user studies. So another key issue for all visualization work is we got to evaluate the visualization. We have to do user studies and understand what's going on and use that to drive iterative design. And we did that with this system. And I'm not going to be able to go into the details. They're in this paper. But they're actually a series of 6 studies we did. Let me show you the key results here. This was after doing a series, this is like the 4th study, after doing a series of iterative designs and getting the system basically to a usable state. Then we did some specific tests comparing sliding versus rotation. We found a significant performance advantage for sliding, but as I said, that may be just that the tasks that we chose were more appropriate for, that displacement was more important to observe than form for those tasks. So this might change if you pick a different set of tasks. We also observed learning effects in both techniques, but there was a significant learning advantage for the sliding animation. That's what this graph is showing. This is a really interesting one. We looked at different animation speeds. We compared instantaneous, no animation, with a fast animation that was at a half a second, medium was 1 second, slow was 2 seconds. There's no significant performance difference between instant, fast, and medium. There is a significant performance decrement for the slow animation. And we did subjective studies and found that the fast animation was highly preferred over all of these. The interesting thing about this result is that it says adding that half-second animation doesn't cost anything in performance, but increases user preference, or users like it a whole lot more. So adding the key advantage of having the animation is that it helps the user maintain context. They track what's going on in the system and don't have to think about what they're looking at. Let's see. There was another study where we compared the sliding animation with a stacked link style, where you actually got to see, each time you made a selection, it would move the previous selection over to the side. So what you're looking at is the current selection on the left and the previous two on the right, and the links are showing you how the selected items appear in each of the visualizations. And much to our surprise, our hypothesis was the linked view would lead to better performance because you could actually see side-by-side comparisons. It turned out that that was not necessary. Sliding animation was enough to let you see the relationship. And there was a clear preference for the simpler sliding animation, I think because this is kind of a complicated view to look at. So we also did a head-to-head comparison between Polyarchy view, head tracks, and the Outlook address book on 15 tasks. And this is basically the simple way of thinking about it is the first 5 tasks are single focus tasks. The second 5 have 2 focus of attention, and the third group of 5 have 3 foci of attention. And this is all normalized based on the 0 line is the Polyarchy performance using Polyarchy. So there's only one task where head tracks was performed better than Polyarchy. In all other cases, Polyarchy had the best performance. And in a number of these cases, especially when you get to 2 focus or 3 focus tasks, the tasks were either extremely hard with the other techniques or not even possible. So you see a real advantage for the technique that I presented for multiple focus problems. So 2 quick summary slides. Summary for the Polyarchy, the visualization I've shown you does solve the multiple focus problems, and it does scale to really large hierarchies. It also solves the multiple hierarchy problem, showing you the relationships between hierarchies. It's significantly faster than existing solutions, as I just showed you on that previous slide. It gets high satisfaction ratings in all of our studies. The design, it was an iterative design that was driven by the user studies, and it's actually something that's shipping with a Microsoft product called the Identity Integration Service. So it's actually getting out there. So, to summarize, as with all information visualization problems, we need to continue exploring ways to reduce cognitive overhead, primarily by using human perception. We also need to continue doing research into novel hierarchy visualizations. I don't think we're there yet. We still need better ways to deal with multiple focus without losing context. And we still need, I think, better solutions for multiple hierarchies. And we need to handle much larger scale. The most recent work is handling hundreds of thousands of nodes, but I think we also need to get up into the millions of nodes. And finally, we need to keep doing user studies on all of the work that we do, and that should lead to better designs, and also, ultimately, it's a requirement for getting these results out into the market, because the decisions about what to develop are based on the results of user studies. So, thank you very much.
As usual, thoughtful and effectively presented history here. I am sorry, I apologize to George and to you about the time constraints, but he had Ed's diplomatic and negotiating skills worked successfully so the instructor is not sort of banging on the door, although we're coming in. But more importantly, he has arranged for the conference, the Dean's Conference Room just next door, 1131G, I guess out and down the hall to the left. So we will continue with questions, which I have several, but you may have others. And so we'll reconvene there briefly now, immediately, until 11:30 for questions. At 1:30 is the roundtable discussion in Amy Lee in 2168.